Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today what I'm going to go through is how you can paint up your rebels for Star Wars Legion. And it's an interesting one because there's not really a single correct answer to this. The rebels, particularly if you've watched some of the shows, they're not terribly well supplied, so the idea of them having a uniform, well, that doesn't really crack on until later in the rebellion. So painting them however you want, they don't even need to match one another, is technically correct. So I've nabbed a couple of techniques from painting historical miniatures here as well, and I'm just going to go with something that looks cool for this particular miniature. All of the paints will be listed in the description below. As well, this one is a 3D print. This comes from Darkfire Designs, and I'll make sure to include a link to them as well. You can also pick up physical prints too, if you don't have a printer. Anyhow, let's get started. So once you've got your miniature assembled, it's time to hit it with a primer spray. Now I've used here, this is the Premium Grey Spray from Vallejo, but anything moderately light is going to work. Something like Grey Seer or Skeleton Bone, anything medium to light will work just fine. I'm using the grey because it's going to work quite nicely with some of the greens that I'm going to use later. Where we'll start then is in painting in her skin, because we're going to start from the bottom and basically paint up as we go. What I'm going to use, this is tanned flesh from the Army Painter. And there's a pretty good reason for this rather than Bugman's Glow. Bugman's Glow is, like, it's a really nice starter color. It's a good base coat for skin. But when you shade it with something like Agrax Earthshade, what happens is it gets really dark. And it can be a little bit of extra work to layer it up and make it look a bit more lively. Whereas tanned flesh, by comparison, this is a bit lighter and a little bit more red, funnily enough. And when you shade that, you don't need to do a huge amount to it to make it look more like skin. Now, even if it looks fine after one coat, I still recommend letting it dry and giving it a second. It gives you a much smoother finish by the time you're done. Now, what we're going to do is something of a rarity on my miniatures. I don't ordinarily paint eyes, but these Legion figures tend to have a little more real estate to work with, which is, they look nicer on the table this way. So what I've got is some white scar, and I'm going to carefully, it's quite hard with the camera in the way, but I'm going to draw a line across the eye. And if I make a god-awful blob of things, it doesn't matter yet. Now, I told you that would be a dreadful mess. What I've got now is some black. I'm using Vallejo's black here, and we'll come back to this later to why, but any black paint will do at this stage. Thin this out a little bit, and then what we'll do is paint a vertical line rather, for her pupil. And again, if I hit, oh, she looks like a lizard. That is not a good look yet. I'll go back now to my tanned flesh, or whatever base coat you're using for the skin, and I can use this now. So now I'll use this to tidy up and paint in the rest of her face again, so it doesn't look quite so big and staring. It'll still take a little bit of finagling, and you'll probably find that you will go back over that area once or twice. Just keep your paints thin so that you're not globbing up all of the detail on the face. I don't think I've still got that quite perfect, but you know, for army work, that's going to be just fine, especially once we shade it. So focusing on the next layer up, what I have here, this is German Camo Beige from Vallejo. Now, this is a little bit darker than Catachan Stone, for example, but I really like using it. It is a wonderful khaki tone. I'm just going to splatter on a couple of layers of this. Got a small base brush and a tiny wee bit of water here. Now, the wonderful thing about rebels is that they don't really have much of a uniform, but they are ordinarily dressed for whatever environment they're fighting in. So if you haven't got exactly the right green or brown or whatever, it doesn't matter. Neither do the rebels. So just cover this over. You'll probably see straight away why I really like this. But like I said, Catachan Stone, maybe Rakarth Flesh in its place. But let's come back in a second once this is done. Now that is a perfect, just generic military beige. I love German Camo Beige. It's great stuff. We're going to move up and paint in her shirt now. And for this, I've got Nurgling Green. Reason being, I do want a light pale green, but I want it to look slightly washed out and faded. So Nurgling green is perfect. You could use Ogryn camo if that's what you've got. Like I mentioned earlier, rebels in uniform, don't worry about it. But you may find with Nurgling green you do need to give it 2 coats. As always, you can be the judge there. Okay, now we're starting to get somewhere. If your miniature has a cravat or a scarf or something around the neck, it's going to be easier to paint that now than trying to paint around the vest in a second. So what I've got is Celestra grey, and I'm using this because I want a sort of an off-white, bluish sort of tint here. And now let's paint that vest. You'll have seen the finished product at the start of the video, so you'll probably notice my base colors are much lighter than the finished product is going to look. What I'm using here, this is Deathworld Forest for the vest. And take your time as you come near the edges of anything that you've already painted. This is a brilliant sort of generic green army man color, so all over the vest. Now with that solid, it's time to determine whether or not you want to add camo to the vests. If I recall correctly, on Endor, Leia is wearing a vest which has a bit of camo on it, and it's a nice skill to have. So what I've got, this is Steel Legion Drab, and painting random patches can actually be quite difficult. So a good way to do this is to just wiggle on a little bit of paint, and then blap, blap, make little Mickey Mouse shapes. It sounds ridiculous, but if you mix them up and change up the size of the ears, let's say, it does quite help. Now remember as well to go right up to the edges of the clothing so that it doesn't look like it's a pattern painted on, but manufactured this way. Now at the same time, I've painted in the boot tops on the boots. I don't know why the rebels are obsessed with canvas boot tops, but they tend to have these cloth covers, so that'll work just fine now. Now, it's a little difficult to see our camo pattern, so what we're going to do is go over the brown with some Baneblade Brown. But instead of covering over it completely, leave a little bit of the original brown showing through. So I'm still using just a medium layer brush. And don't worry if you're not completely covering that brown, just dot, 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 dot. And speaking of those boots, I've got Catachan flesh here, and I'm going to use this to paint these in. And I'm also going to paint in her belt with this. This is a nice dark brown, which has got a reddish warmth to it. It's really pleasant, without being as dark as something like Rhinox hide, which of course you can use just as happily if you like to look at that. Now a couple of those pouches are going to look like they're leather as well, so I've painted those in at the same time, whereas others look a little more like fabric. So for the fabric ones, assuming they're like a canvas material, I'm going to paint these in with Death Guard green, which is another really nice army man sort of color to have in your arsenal. You could also use Morghast bone here if you wanted a beige finish. But I figure if I'm going for this sort of temperate look, then green is probably a better choice. Before we paint in those few metal details, like her buckles and what have you, we'll paint in the lenses on her goggles. Any nice light blue will do the job here. I'm using, this is Russ Grey. And then for those handful of metal details, I'm going to use Leadbelcher. Now this is a bit darker than I would ordinarily use, but I am planning to highlight this one later. So any buckles, take your time here. Little bits on her belt and what have you. Leadbelcher time. And then the last thing to do before we shade her is to go back to that black, and we're going to paint this carefully over her blaster. Now it's at this point that you can go back and do any little bits of tidy up that you feel you need to. I've also gone in with a few little dots of that black just to make that camo scheme a little more interesting. What we're going to do now though is to shade them. And what I've got here, this is my little bottle of mixed up, this is roughly half and half, Agrax Earthshade and Lahmian medium. Now, it doesn't matter if you use the old or the new Agrax, once it's got the medium in there it's going to behave the same way. I've thinned this down because I don't want it to darken the colors of everything too much. I'm still going to get my shading effect, and it will dull things down a little, but it's not going to make everything dark brown. So going over the entire miniature, making sure to work this into the recesses, and don't let it pull too heavily on places like the face. Work it around, move it with your brush, and yeah, let's come back once I've done this in about half an hour's time, once this is dried. Now there, once our shade is dried, what we've got is something, well, we can put that on the table. The green turned out a little bit darker than I had planned, but I still think that works all right. If I wanted to, I could go ahead and I might brighten it up. I'll have a think about that. Anyhow, what we're going to do is to dry brush some of the parts of the miniature, just so that there's a little bit more depth to them. Now what I've got here, I say this all the time, and I will never understate the usefulness of a really crap brush. Go to the stationery aisle, in even supermarkets, anywhere that you can pick up these really cheap, nasty brushes that you can just batter around. They come in all sorts of sizes, cheap. All right, make sure that you get the stuff that you're not going to miss when you beat it to absolute smithereens. So what I have is Terminatus Stone, and I have made sure there is the very faintest whisper, the tiniest remnant of this left on my brush, and I think I've probably taken too much off. But if I pass over the same area a few times, there we go. We build that up, and we get a highlight, which doesn't take a lot of work. And because we're using such a small brush, we can still get most of the areas on her trousers without having to worry about hitting other areas. So this is what I say, crap brushes. They're actually really useful. So I'm going to take my time, do a couple of passes on all of the clothing, or the trousers, and up on her hat as well. Now even up on her hat, that's just dry brushing. A few passes to get a bit of depth, and yeah, works really well for me. If you wanted to, you could go back and highlight the trousers and what have you by mixing in a little bit of pallid witch flesh to the original color. Works really well as a sort of ivory mix. But no, you don't need to. So still using the same brush, I've got some Underhive Ash, and I'm going to do the same thing here to the green parts. So very, very lightly at first. Let's build up. Yeah, a bit of texture. And if it does go a little bit chalky, don't worry too much. We are going to solve that with a varnish. And now the final dry brush we're going to apply is some Necron Compound. I'm doing this one last because it's where I'm least likely to hit any of the other areas of detail. So I did hit her blaster with a little bit of green, but now you don't see it because we've gone over the top of it. And I don't need to do very much of this at all. As a matter of fact, that's probably plenty. Now, through all of this, there is one color where I really made a mistake early on, and that was using the beige for the camo pattern. I really want that to stand out a little bit more. So I'm going to scrag brown here, and I am going over the top of shading and or what have you, but I think this is going to make things look a little more interesting, and I've already got my pattern down. Something to change next time I do this. Okay, that looks way better. So now that I've tidied that up, because I did dry brush over the top of everything, I'm going to dull down some of the black dots again with a bit of fresh black. I think I probably did those out of order the first time around, but it's all part of experimenting. All right, and there we go. I think that looks much better. I think I've inadvertently almost painted her in German Flecktarn, but it works. So never be afraid to play around and experiment. It's just paint. Speaking of, let's finish off her face. It's really one of the last details to do. So I have Cadian Flesh Tone, and what I'm going to do is get her in shot. And I'm going to cover over most of her face with Cadian Flesh Tone, leaving just our shaded tanned flesh in the recesses. The one exception here is I'm going to leave her bottom lip. I tend to find, instead of mucking around trying to find a way to paint that or glaze it red or what have you, just leave it your darker shaded skin tone, and that will look fine. So just a tiny wee bit of paint on your brush at a time. build up those layers, and away we go. It's actually super difficult to show you this because the cap brim hides her face, but we're going to move on to Kislev flesh and start painting in some of these extra details. So here's where we're going to start defining some of the shape of her face. So a little bit more across her nose, cheekbones, and so forth. Now the final step that I'm going for is a little bit of flayed one flesh, and this is where I'm going to pick out extreme edges of her nose, her chin, the backs and knuckles and what have you. Now I like painting faces. I know not everybody necessarily does, but I tend to think it's where you can get a lot of extra character into your miniatures, so it's worth practicing. And I think you'll find that once you do get a handle on it, it's a lot of fun. Now the final highlight I'm going to apply, this is the Vallejo Model Air Metallic Steel. And I really like using the Model Air range for highlights. They just tend to flow very nicely. You can just as easily here use Runefang Steel or Stormhost Silver, whatever you've got your hands on. There's not really a right answer to this. I realize I'm telling dirty fibs. There is one last highlight I want to apply. And it's going to be just a tiny bit of Fenrisian Grey in the corners. Now I might do this off screen actually, but in the corners of her goggles. Now what I'm going to do is apply a matte varnish over the entire miniature. What I'm using here, this is Varnish Plus from Instar. You can pick a matte varnish that you like. I recommend something like an ultra matte if you can find something. Make sure that you tap your camera a couple of times with your brush while you're applying it. Don't let it pull too heavily in any recesses. Now, if it does, you might get a little bit of chalky residue in there, which doesn't look too great. Once that has thoroughly dried, a little bit of gloss varnish over the goggles will help those shine. What I'll do then is to pop a quick base on her. Let's get a look at what she looks like when she is all finished. And there at last, our Rebel Trooper is complete, and I had a lot of fun painting her. I know I say it all the time, but this really was a blast, and doing something simple with one or two nice little finishes, like doing everything by dry brushing and then just touching in her face was nice. You know, I really enjoy sometimes just cutting back a little, not highlighting everything, and enjoying the experience of finishing something. And I tend to find dry brushing super useful for that. So whether you do want to spend the extra time and highlight, you know, you've seen me do that before, and I particularly recommend checking out the Ivory video for that one. But this is done, and I'm more than happy to add it to the collection. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, and all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Rod, Andrew, and Jimmy. Your support lets me keep buying resin. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.